She walked into a millionaire's office to apply for a secretary job, but her eyes didn't search for opportunity. They searched for something buried, something broken, something lost. Claire Whitmore wasn't just looking for work. She was searching for answers about a mother who vanished without a trace, and a powerful family that might have had everything except the truth. Nathaniel Hale was the man in the expensive suit, the CEO who had inherited a legacy, but never questioned the cost. What happens when two people meet, one chasing truth, the other hiding from it? Can justice and love exist in the same room? Can forgiveness grow where betrayal once lived? And what if healing doesn't come from revenge, but from a single, quiet act of listening? This isn't a story of fairy tales. It's a story of undoing, of becoming, of learning how to hold truth in one hand and hope in the other. If you believe stories can heal, can change, can bring us closer, then stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And now, let the story begin. She walked into his office like she didn't belong, but not because she lacked the confidence. No, it was something quieter. Something that said, "I'm not here for the job you think I'm applying for." It was a Monday morning in late October, the kind of morning where the city was dressed in its finest burnished golds and brittle reds clinging to trees along the streets of Chicago. The breeze off the lake had a bite to it now, and commuters moved faster, collars raised, fingers wrapped tight around to-go cups. It was the kind of season that asked for truth, that exposed everything in its path. Claire Whitmore stood at the entrance of Hale Holdings, hands tucked neatly into the pockets of her long gray coat. The building towered above her like a monument, its glass and steel catching morning light in a way that made it look alive, pulsing. But Claire wasn't intimidated. She had walked into bigger storms before. Quieter ones, maybe, but storms, nonetheless. Inside, the lobby was all clean lines and whispers, marble floors, brass railings, minimalist art that made a point of being expensive without saying a word. A uniformed receptionist offered a polite smile, confirmed her name, and pointed her toward the elevator. "He's ready for you?" Claire nodded, her voice barely more than a breath. "Thank you." In the elevator, she pressed the button for the 32nd floor, the executive suite, and took a single, steadying breath. Her reflection in the brushed steel doors stared back at her. Composed, calm. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a navy blue dress, modest heels, no jewelry, but a small silver watch. The kind of look that said capable, unremarkable, harmless. The doors opened to a corridor bathed in natural light and silence. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a painting. But Claire's eyes didn't wander. She followed the hallway to the end, where a second receptionist greeted her and offered a seat. Through a wall of glass, she could see the office walnut desk, leather chairs, perfectly arranged bookshelves, a space curated with precision. A door opened. A man stepped out. Nathaniel Hale. He didn't smile, not quite, just a polite tilt of the head, eyes scanning her with quiet calculation. He wore a dark suit tailored, conservative, and carried himself like someone who never had to raise his voice to get what he wanted. Everything about him was measured, controlled. Even his presence seemed to occupy exactly the right amount of space, never more. "Claire Whitmore," he asked. She stood, nodded, yes. He extended a hand, firm but brief, then motioned for her to follow him into the office. The door closed behind them with a quiet click. The room smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Claire sat down opposite him, crossing her ankles neatly beneath her chair. He picked up a slim folder from his desk, her resume, and flipped through it again, though she could tell he'd already read it. Probably twice. "You taught literature, I did. At a university, Indiana State." His brow lifted slightly. "And now you're looking for an administrative position." "I'm looking for quiet work," she said. "Something steady." She didn't elaborate, didn't offer a story about burnout or relocation or changing careers. Just the truth, in its simplest form. He watched her for a long moment, fingers steepled. There was a kind of silence in the room that asked you to defend yourself, but Claire didn't fill it. She let it stand. Something in that made him nod, slowly. "We can try it," he said. "2 weeks. If it's a fit, we'll make it permanent. Thank you." He glanced down at a document on his desk, then back at her. "You'll report directly to me. Hours are 8 to 5. Lunch is flexible. There's a team, but they don't like micromanagement." She offered the smallest of smiles. "Neither do I." That was it. He stood, signaling the meeting was over. Claire followed him out, past the glass wall, past the assistant who handed her a welcome packet and a badge with her name already printed on it. Efficient, precise. By 10:30, she was seated at her new desk just outside his office, arranging paper clips into perfect lines. She hadn't come for the job. She came for what was on the other side of that door, that afternoon. As Nathaniel stepped out for a phone call, Claire glanced briefly toward his office. The door had closed, but not fully, just enough to let her see the frame on his desk. A photo. 4 men in suits, standing on a manicured lawn. One of them was William Hale, Nathaniel's father. The others wore the same kind of confidence, the same practiced smiles. But one face made her blood still. Gerald Linwood, former city commissioner, retired early. Once the subject of an anonymous expose that never got published. The same name that appeared in her mother's handwritten notes circled in red, underlined twice. Claire didn't stare, just long enough to memorize the angle of the frame, the placement of the photo, long enough to confirm what she already suspected. She turned back to her desk and picked up a folder, as if she'd been reading all along. At 5:15, she rode the elevator back down, blending into the stream of professionals heading out into the twilight. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. She walked 4 blocks to her apartment, a modest 3rd-floor walk-up with no doorman, no security cameras, no trace of Hale Holdings' polished world, just a creaky staircase and the smell of old wood. Inside, she peeled off her coat, set the kettle on the stove, and pulled a canvas bag from the back of her closet. Inside a single file folder, worn at the edges. On the tab, written in faded ink, Margaret Whitmore, 2014. She sat on the floor, the folder in her lap. Carefully, she opened it. Photos, notes, a stapled document marked confidential, newspaper clippings with circles drawn around headlines, names scrawled in the margins. And at the center of it all, one typed report that had never been published, stamped draft in the corner. Claire traced her finger along the edge of the paper. Her mother's last story, or the beginning of it. She closed her eyes, the weight of the day settling into her shoulders. Nathaniel Hale didn't know it yet. Not what she was doing there. Not why she'd chosen his company. Not why, when she looked at him, she wasn't seeing a boss. She was seeing a door her mother had never been allowed to walk through. Claire sipped her tea slowly, then leaned back against the wall. His world, she thought, was already beginning to shift. The last time Claire saw her mother, she was holding a folder labeled Hale Holdings Internal. That folder disappeared the day Margaret Whitmore did. Claire had been 26 then, still young enough to believe in the permanence of people, old enough to know when someone was truly gone. The night her mother vanished, there was no grand farewell, no mystery in the moment, just a message on the answering machine, Margaret's voice steady, saying she'd be home late, that she was following a lead. She never came back. The police had theories, of course, foul play, voluntary disappearance, suicide, but none of them had known Margaret Whitmore not the way Claire had. Her mother wasn't reckless. She didn't run. She confronted. She exposed. She pushed. And that folder labeled and sealed with names too powerful to print had been her last act of defiance. For 10 years, Claire had tried to forget, tried to move forward by immersing herself in other people's words. She became a lecturer in literature at a quiet university in Indiana, tucked among the cornfields and quiet neighborhoods. She taught stories about ghosts and grief, about women who left without saying goodbye. It was safer than facing her own. But the past had a habit of waiting. It found her one spring afternoon, tucked between the pages of the bell jar, a book she had borrowed from her mother's shelf when she was 16. Inside, an old grocery receipt had been folded twice, then unfolded and folded again, its creases softened by time. But it wasn't the paper that caught her eye. It was what was written on the back. HH 32nd floor. Linwood. Cross-check. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her mother's, in black felt-tip pen. Claire had stared at the note for a long time. At first, it had meant nothing, just a fragment. But the initials, H.H. Hale Holdings, 32nd floor, and Linwood, a name she hadn't heard since the week Margaret disappeared, a former commissioner. A name scrawled in red ink on a now-missing report. She had gone to class that day, delivered a lecture on Sylvia Plath and silence, and then handed in her resignation that same afternoon. She didn't tell her colleagues why she was leaving. She didn't tell her few friends why she was selling her car or subletting her apartment or packing 2 suitcases. She just did it because something had shifted. That note was a door, and 10 years was long enough to stand outside of it. Now, 3 weeks into her new life as Nathaniel Hale's secretary, Claire moved through each day with a quiet precision that mirrored the building she worked in. Her desk was always tidy, her answers always brief. She never asked questions beyond what was required, and she watched. She watched Nathaniel arrive each morning at exactly 8:02, always with a coffee in hand, always dressed in shades of gray or navy. She watched how he greeted the janitor by name but never made small talk, how he remembered birthdays but forgot to respond to emails unless they involved money, how he spoke of legacy but never mentioned his father's legal troubles or the internal restructuring after William Hale's sudden death. He wasn't unkind. He wasn't warm either. He was rehearsed, as if everything about him had been carefully scripted. Claire knew the type. She'd grown up around politicians and activists, watching her mother interview them with velvet gloves that hid iron fists. She knew how power worked, how it disguised itself in charm or stillness or clean-cut suits. But even as she watched Nathaniel, she wasn't sure what she was hoping to see. Guilt, fear, or something less definable like recognition. Each night, after work, Claire returned to her small walk-up apartment and slipped back into a different life, one that smelled like old paper and remembered voices. She would change into soft clothes, make tea the way her mother did, strong, black, 2 teaspoons of honey, and then sit on the living room floor with the box. A wooden chest her mother had once used to store photographs. Now it held only records. There were clippings from old articles, receipts, handwritten notes, a manila envelope containing names, addresses, and printouts of city contracts dating back 15 years. All of it cataloged in Margaret's meticulous scrawl. But it wasn't just the data that mattered. It was the patterns. And that night, Claire found one she hadn't seen before, a folded city zoning map, dated 6 months before her mother's disappearance. Several buildings were circled, including one in bold red inks, HH, 32nd floor. A small X sat next to it, almost like an afterthought. Claire smoothed the paper with both hands, feeling her breath catch. She reached for another folder, this one labeled Whistleblowers Unverified. Inside, she found a list partial, incomplete of names her mother had collected. Most were scribbled, half legible, but one stood out: Gerald Linwood, retired, office address, 32nd floor, HH. Claire leaned back against the wall. The coincidence was gone. In its place, a line that led from her mother's note to Linwood, to this building, this floor, and maybe to Nathaniel Hale. She didn't believe he had anything to do with Margaret's disappearance, not directly. He would have been in his early 30s then, freshly installed as COO, still new, still following, but he was here, and the legacy he defended so quietly had teeth. Claire closed the folder and stared at the window. The city lights were just beginning to flicker on, one by one, like secrets refusing to stay buried. She thought of her mother, how she used to hum when she typed, how she always carried 3 pens in her bag in case one ran dry, how she taught Claire to find the story behind the silence, and how she'd never come home from chasing that final one. Claire reached for her notebook and opened it to a fresh page. The paper smelled faintly of cardboard and lavender. She wrote slowly, deliberately. He doesn't know it yet, but his world is already starting to shift. She paused, then underlined it once. Just once. Outside. The wind scraped against the building, and the sound made her think of voices. Not screaming, not crying, just waiting. Claire never smiled too brightly, never asked too many questions, and that made Nathaniel trust her faster than he should have. She became part of the rhythm of the office, the way sunlight gradually settles into a room without being noticed. She didn't draw attention, she didn't offer commentary, she moved like someone used to being invisible, and in that invisibility, she found space, space to observe, to remember, to calculate. By her 3rd week, Nathaniel had stopped giving her instructions. He didn't need to. She had memorized the cadence of his workdays, the emails he responded to within minutes, the ones he ignored, which clients made him tighten his jaw, which ones made him lean back in his chair and lower his voice. She scheduled his meetings, arranged his travel, tracked his contracts, efficiently, quietly, without error. And so, he began to speak, not often, not with ease, but in the quiet stretches between meetings or in the late afternoon when the city softened into gold, he would pause, just long enough to let something slip through the armor. "My mother was nothing like my father," he said once, not looking up from his screen. She hated this place. Claire had looked up briefly, eyebrows raised just enough to acknowledge the remark without inviting more. She used to say, he continued, that people forget how to listen in buildings this tall. She smiled faintly, then turned back to her keyboard. No comment, no encouragement. And in that silence, he spoke again. She died in Vermont. Wouldn't even come back to Chicago. She said the shadows here were too long. That was all he said that day. But it was more than enough. He never mentioned his mother again. But over the following weeks, bits and pieces of his world surfaced. A photograph on his shelf, standing in front of a white clapboard house with a book in hand. An old postcard she'd written him in college. "You are more than his legacy, Nathaniel. Don't forget that." Claire read every detail without touching a thing. She remembered it all, and in the evenings, when the building emptied and the lights dimmed, she stayed behind just long enough to scan through archived files, copies of old board memos, investment histories, property transfers. Most of them benign, some of them curious, especially the series of shell acquisitions made in 2013 under William Hale's name, right before the company's rapid expansion into state redevelopment projects. Projects her mother had investigated in the final year of her life. Claire didn't draw conclusions. Not yet. She wasn't here to accuse. She was here to watch, to wait. One afternoon, as she placed a fresh copy of the quarterly reports on Nathaniel's desk, he glanced up with something like amusement in his eyes. "You never ask about anything," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "Should I? Most people want to know more. About the company? About me?" Claire smiled, small and non-committal. "I needed quiet work," she said simply. "And I knew this office was quiet." Nathaniel let out the smallest laugh. "That's one way to put it." Then he leaned back, studying her not suspiciously, but curiously, as if trying to place a painting that looked familiar but hung in the wrong gallery. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. If this was a game, she would not move first. That night, at home. Claire opened a secure email account, one she'd created months ago under a false name. She composed a message. "You don't know me, but I think you knew Margaret Whitmore. She was my mother. I'm not reaching out as a journalist, just as a daughter. If you're willing to talk off the record, I'll listen." She attached nothing, no photo, no contact information, just the initials CW. Then she addressed the message to a man named Daniel Monroe, a former records analyst who had worked briefly at Hale Holdings the year Margaret disappeared. He had been let go for unauthorized data access. Claire had found his name in one of her mother's handwritten notes. She hesitated only once before clicking send. The next morning, she moved through the office like she always did, calm, focused, invisible. She scheduled Nathaniel's meetings, responded to vendor queries, booked a luncheon for the board. At 11:46 a.m., an email arrived in her inbox, not from Daniel Monroe's full name, but from a Gmail account that simply read, DM, research, archive. There was no greeting, no signature, just 5 words. You're not your mother? Claire stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a welcome, it was something else entirely, something layered. She felt it settle in her stomach like a stone. What did he mean? That she wasn't as brave, that she wasn't ready, that she was walking a path she didn't understand. She closed the message and sat back, her mind turning. If this were chess, the opening moves had just been made, and someone had noticed. Every day at 5:30, Claire brought Nathaniel a cup of black tea. It wasn't part of her job, but he never asked why, and she never told him. It had started the second week she worked there. She'd noticed the empty mug on the edge of his desk, left untouched since morning rim, stained faintly from strong coffee. His eyes had looked heavier than usual that day, the lines beside them sharper, though he never complained about the hours or the pressure. The next afternoon, at precisely 5:30, she placed a cup of steaming Earl Grey on the small side table near the window. No milk, no sugar. She didn't announce it, didn't linger, and he didn't ask. He simply picked it up, sipped it once, and nodded once in acknowledgement. After that, it became quiet ritual. No words, just tea. Every day. Sometimes he drank it while finishing emails. Sometimes he walked to the window and watched the traffic stretch across the city in ribbons of light. But more and more often, he stopped working when the tea arrived, as if the clock shifted with the cup in his hand. By the 3rd week, Claire started bringing 2 cups. She would sit across from him, still on duty, in theory, and they would drink in silence, occasionally exchanging fragments of thought, not business, not gossip, just ideas. One evening, Nathaniel asked, "Do you ever listen to Schumann?" Claire looked up from her tea, piano or chamber. He smiled, surprised. Piano. She nodded. Chrysleriana. It unsettles me. In a good way. That was the first time they shared music. He pulled up a playlist from his phone, and for the next 20 minutes, the office belonged to someone else's memory, haunted chords and the delicate dissonance filling the space between them. After that, they shared more. Pieces by Satie, old vinyl rips of Ravel, a live Chopin recording from a forgotten hall in Vienna. Once, he asked what she was reading. She told him The Things They Carried. He paused, then retrieved a book from his shelf and handed it to her. The Remains of the Day. Different kinds of silence, he said. She read it in 2 nights and returned it with a note. Some silences aren't passive. They choose not to speak. He kept the note tucked inside the book. By early November, the tea was no longer an afterthought. It was an anchor. Nathaniel began to measure his day not by meetings or earnings, but by the arrival of Claire's quiet presence at 5:30. She didn't fill the room with noise. She didn't demand attention, but her stillness had gravity. And then, one Thursday, she didn't come. The clock blinked past 5:30, then 5:42. Nathaniel refreshed his inbox, glanced toward the door. Her desk outside was empty, chair pushed in, neat as always. He tried to return to the spreadsheet in front of him, but the numbers blurred. A dull hum settled behind his temples, the kind of discomfort that came not from a missed appointment, but from something deeper, something he wasn't used to naming. He called her cell phone. No answer. He almost never called. At 6:17, she walked in, damp from the drizzle outside. Her coat clung to her shoulders, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold. "Sorry," she said softly. I had to stop by the post office. Lost track of time. He nodded but didn't reply, just looked at her a second longer than usual. She placed the tea beside him, as if nothing had happened. That night, they didn't listen to music. Instead, they talked. Claire sat quietly, hands wrapped around her cup. The rain tapped gently against the windows. Nathaniel spoke first. Did you ever believe in the idea of inherited character? Claire tilted her head, not answering immediately. He continued, like, whether who we are is shaped by the people who came before, not just genetically, but morally. She considered that for a moment. I think we carry echoes, but not commands. He let out a breath. Slow. My grandfather was accused of embezzlement. Back in the 40s, he ran a railroad union. Very powerful man. Never went to trial. Claire stayed quiet. My father used to say, "We handle things quietly in this family." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. They made it disappear, bought silence, bribed witnesses. It was a lesson in what Claire asked. Nathaniel looked at her, then really looked, in how truth is often a luxury. The room fell still. The city buzzed below, but in that office, there was only the sound of their breathing and the low hum of something fragile being handed across a table. Claire didn't respond. She let the weight of his words settle, not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew what it meant to carry someone else's shame without the tools to set it down. A long silence passed. Then Nathaniel stood, walked to the bookshelf, and ran his fingers along the spines of first editions. He wasn't looking for anything, just moving. When he turned back, there was something softer in his face, a loosening. "There's a dinner at my house this weekend," he said casually. "Saturday night. Some colleagues, some friends. Nothing formal." Claire waited. He hesitated, then added, "Would you come, not as my secretary?" Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't look surprised. She simply studied him, measured the space between the question and what it really meant. "All right," she said after a moment, and with that, something shifted again, gently, like two chess pieces moving, not to attack, but to open up new possibilities on the board. She wore navy blue, not black, not red, just quiet navy. And when she stepped into his house, she knew this was the night it would all begin to end. The house on Waverly Hill sat behind a wrought iron gate, modest by billionaire standards, but still clearly marked by old money. The kind of house that had been renovated, not rebuilt, preserved, not flaunted. A gravel path curved toward the door, lined with trimmed hedges and lanterns that glowed softly in the autumn air. Claire paused at the door, smoothing the fabric of her dress with one hand. Her heels were simple, her hair pinned neatly. A small pendant her mother's rested against her collarbone. She'd chosen everything with care, understated, precise. She looked like a woman arriving for a dinner party, not a reckoning. Nathaniel opened the door himself. He wore a charcoal blazer over a light blue shirt, open at the collar. He looked surprised, just for a moment, then pleased. "You're early," he said, voice soft. "I wanted to see the place before everyone else arrived." He stepped aside, and she entered. The house smelled of aged wood and something simmering in the kitchen rosemary. Maybe. Jazz played low from the speakers. On the walls were black and white photographs, city skylines, mountain ranges, portraits of unknown faces captured mid-laughter. "This used to be my grandmother's place," he said, almost absent-mindedly. "She never liked guests. Thought people ruined the air." Claire smiled. She wasn't wrong. He chuckled and led her to the living room, where soft amber lamps cast a golden hue across bookshelves and leather chairs. Everything was warm, intentional, disarming. The other guests arrived soon after. A senator and his wife, a retired judge, a man introduced only as Robert, who once chaired something Claire couldn't quite catch. They all shook her hand politely, their eyes lingering just a moment too long. She was new, unfamiliar, a variable. Dinner was served at a long walnut table under a chandelier that didn't sparkle so much as glow. The conversation flowed easily. Politics, art, travel, the market. Claire said little, listening instead, storing details like she always did. Then came the shift. It happened halfway through the second course. The Judge Whitmore, ironically, though no relation, turned to her with a casual smile. "Whitmore," he said, swirling his wine. "Any relation to the late Margaret Whitmore?" The journalist Claire kept her face still. "She was my mother." A pause. Subtle. "But there—" "Ah," the man said. "Brilliant woman, sharp, too sharp, perhaps." Nathaniel laughed lightly, too quickly. "She wrote a few pieces on zoning corruption, didn't she?" The senator chimed in, almost offhand. Claire looked at Nathaniel. His face had closed, just slightly, enough to notice. "She did," Claire said calmly. "Her last investigation was unfinished." Another pause. The air shifted. Someone changed the subject to the wine. Nathaniel leaned in, murmuring something to the server, and the table moved on. But Claire didn't. And she noticed something else. Nathaniel hadn't spoken her mother's name. Not once. He could have said, "Yes, I remember her," or "She did good work," or even, "That must be difficult for you." But instead, he diverted, redirected, silenced. That silence spoke volumes. She studied him from across the table, the way his fingers tapped the rim of his glass, the way he avoided her eyes. For weeks now, she had seen layers in him: stillness, grace, even gentleness. But tonight, for the first time, she saw something else. Cowardice. Not the loud kind, not the brash refusal to face truth, but the quiet, well-practiced kind. The kind that looked like diplomacy, like tact, like keeping peace at the cost of justice. Later, after the dishes had been cleared and the guests began to filter toward the sitting room for brandy and conversation, Nathaniel offered to drive her home. They didn't speak on the way to the car. The gravel crunched beneath their feet like unspoken thoughts. The night air was crisp, scented faintly with fallen leaves and wood smoke. He opened the passenger door for her, and she slid in, her hands folded neatly in her lap. They drove in silence through the dark streets, past the city's sleeping edges, and then Claire spoke, softly, clearly. "Would you still love me if I told you I came here to destroy everything your family built?" Nathaniel blinked for a moment. It looked like he hadn't heard her. Then he smiled, not cruelly, not nervously, just faintly, like someone recognizing the setup to a joke. "That's dramatic," he said, still watching the road. Claire didn't reply. He glanced at her. "You're serious." She turned to look out the window. "I'm tired." They didn't speak again. He dropped her off at her building, walked her to the door like always. But there was distance now. Something unsaid, stretching taut between them. She didn't invite him up. He didn't ask. Inside, Claire hung up her coat, slipped off her shoes, and turned on the lamp by the window. The city pulsed quietly below. She crossed the room and knelt beside her bookshelf, reaching behind the lowest row. There, hidden behind a stack of outdated paperbacks, was a narrow silver key. She used it to unlock the safe behind the panel in her closet wall. Inside folders, dozens of them, labeled, organized, some marked with her mother's handwriting, others with her own. She pulled them all out and laid them on the floor. Tonight wasn't for analysis. Tonight was for assembly. She spread out maps, financial reports, internal memos. She pinned pages to her corkboard, drawing lines between names and dates. She highlighted the transfers of funds that happened within days of city contracts being awarded. She underlined Nathaniel's signature on a document approving a deal that linked back to one of Linwood's subsidiaries. She worked methodically, quietly, almost reverently. At 2:14 a.m., she stood back and looked at the wall. The whole picture was beginning to take shape. Not just corruption, cover-up, not just silence, complicity. She picked up her notebook and wrote one line across the top of a fresh page. Let's begin. She stood in the room full of suits and silence, and for the first time, Claire Whitmore raised her voice. The annual board meeting of Hale Holdings was held in a private conference suite on the 48th floor, the kind of space where ceilings were high enough to make people feel small and windows wide enough to make the skyline look like a possession. Claire had never been invited to this meeting. Secretaries didn't attend, assistants didn't speak here, only names that move markets and hands that sign checks. But that morning, Claire arrived not as an assistant. She wore a gray wool coat, too light for the early winter wind, and carried a simple leather portfolio tucked against her chest like a fragile truth. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floors as she entered, and when the assistant at the door asked for her name, Claire simply replied, "Tell them I'm here for 5 minutes. That's all I need." Inside, the boardroom buzzed with quiet voices and clinking coffee cups. Men and women in tailored suits scrolled through quarterly earnings on tablets, nodded at charts projected on the wall, discussed supply chains and market volatility like weather patterns. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, sharp suit, expression composed, eyes distant. He hadn't seen her yet. Claire walked in slowly. The room didn't fall silent immediately. It faded into stillness, piece by piece, as her presence registered, and then, suddenly, it was quiet. Nathaniel turned. The moment their eyes met, something cracked, not visibly, but inside him. Claire. She didn't flinch. "I won't take long," she said. Her voice was clear, not loud, but carried, the kind of voice that didn't ask permission. She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her portfolio and held it gently, as if it might tear under pressure. Then she began to read. "I no longer trust anyone who shakes hands in that building. They smile too easily. They offer coffee, but record your words. One of them followed me home today. I don't know which one, but I saw him, and I know now this isn't just a story. It's a warning." Margaret Whitmore, July 17th, 2014. The room remained still. No interruptions, no whispers. Even the hum of the ceiling vent seemed to quiet itself. Claire continued. "I came here under false pretenses. I lied about my background, about why I wanted this job, and I would do it again." Her eyes didn't leave Nathaniel's, because the last time my mother told someone the truth, she disappeared. A muscle in Nathaniel's jaw shifted. Claire walked forward, placing the portfolio on the table. Inside, everything. Photocopies, notes, maps, memos. The entire architecture of a legacy built not just on capital, but on silence. She didn't slam it down, didn't point fingers. She just laid it there, like a body. "I'm not asking you to read it now," she said, "but you should. And when you do, ask yourself what kind of name you're protecting." Someone cleared their throat, someone else shifted in their seat, but Claire's eyes never left Nathaniel's. She leaned slightly closer. "Now you decide what kind of legacy you want to leave." Then she turned, walked to the door, and left the room without another word. Downstairs, the lobby felt colder than it had when she arrived. She stepped into the wind without flinching. She didn't look back. By the time she reached the train station, her phone buzzed. A single notification. Subject FWRE surveillance files. Margaret Whitmore sender anonymous. Internal server leak. Her heart stilled. She opened the attachment. It was an internal memo, dated August 2014. Subject line observations on external press inquiries. M.W. The body was short, matter of fact. Per instructions from W. H. External journalist Margaret Whitmore is to be tracked for media coordination. Any records or meetings involving development proposals, ESP. 16th and Kingsley should be scrubbed. Contact to be maintained with G. L. for advisement. Filed by R. Darnell CC Legal Team, PR Liaison, status sensitive. Do not archive. Claire closed the file. She didn't need to read it again. Her hands trembled, not from fear, not from rage, from the weight of something that had always been suspected, and now, finally, laid bare. Back at the 48th floor, Nathaniel remained seated long after the others had begun speaking again. Someone offered a joke, someone else shifted the agenda, but he didn't hear them. He reached slowly into the drawer of the table beside him and pulled out the old photo frame. 4 men, 1 woman, a lawn behind them, power frozen in time. His father stood at the center. Nathaniel stared at that familiar face. The jawline, the eyes, the posture that had once seemed unshakable. But now, something else stood out. The way his father's hand rested on Gerald Linwood's shoulder. Too familiar, too casual. Nathaniel had always believed that what made Hale Holdings strong was its history, its discipline, its discretion. Now, all he could see was its damage. He placed the photo down, face first, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do next. He had memorized her smile, her silence, her way of folding tea napkins into perfect squares. But somehow, he'd never really learned who Claire Whitmore was. The press came fast, the board faster. Nathaniel's phone buzzed day and night, requests for statements, demands for explanations, quiet warnings from public relations firms. There were articles, podcasts, a few late-night segments with clever titles like Tea and Truth at Hale Holdings. The board suspended him within 48 hours. Pending internal review of all transactions under William Hale's tenure, the phrasing was clean, almost polite, but the meaning was clear. You're out, for now, maybe forever. He didn't protest, didn't call in favors, didn't fight. He just left. He returned home alone, slipped his keys onto the entryway table, and sat down on the edge of the leather couch without removing his coat. The room around him, once filled with quiet rituals and curated warmth, now felt artificial. Like a showroom he no longer belonged to. For the next few days, Nathaniel drifted. He walked through the city like a man who had misplaced something essential but didn't know where to start looking. He wandered through old bookstores, sat on benches in Lincoln Park, bought coffee and let it go cold in his hands. One afternoon, he found himself near the conservatory, the place Claire had once mentioned, in passing, loving in springtime. The fall flowers were fading now, gold giving way to rust. He stood among the wilting hydrangeas and thought about the way she had noticed things. Not the things people wanted her to see, the things they tried to hide. He sat on a wooden bench near the fountain. A child fed pigeons nearby, laughing as they scattered. Nathaniel watched the ripples on the water. He couldn't remember the last time he had sat in silence without a screen in front of him. That night, back at his house, he opened her employee file. It was still in the system. Claire Whitmore, date of birth, emergency contact, academic history, employment history, clean, respectable, average. Except it wasn't. He knew that now. He paged through it again, slowly, not for facts, but for fingerprints, trying to censor between the lines. She had left no notes, no resignation letter, no personal items. But beneath the last page of her scanned documents, something unusual caught his eye. A photo. It wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't official. Just an old image scanned in grayscale, faint, grainy. Margaret Whitmore, her mother, hair tied back, eyes sharp, standing in front of a courthouse with a recorder in hand and a folder clutched to her chest. There was something in her expression that felt familiar, something that didn't come from the photograph, but from memory. Nathaniel had seen that same look before, on Claire, when she was listening, when she was deciding whether to trust. He closed the file slowly and leaned back, eyes unfocused. He remembered the tea at 5:30, the way she never asked him to explain himself, the way she sat across from him in silence and offered no judgment, just presence. And he remembered all the things she had said plainly, quietly, that he had chosen not to hear, not because she wasn't clear, because he hadn't wanted to listen, because part of him assumed that silence meant safety, that someone who didn't speak their anger would never wield it. He hadn't feared her. He hadn't respected her either, not truly. He had liked her, admired her grace, but he had never really wondered who she was when she left the office each night. Until now, later that week, in the storage room near legal, he asked the records clerk if Claire had submitted any additional files before she left. The woman handed him a sealed envelope with his name on it, handwritten, in that precise, looped script Claire always used on labels. He brought it home and opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, not to him. It began with "Dear Mom, Nathaniel froze." He read it anyway. "Dear Mom, it's almost done. I think I'm close. I don't know what I'll find exactly, but I'm following your trail, and it feels like walking through a house I've never entered but somehow already know. Nathaniel is kind, or at least he wants to be, but he also wears his father's shadow like a tailored suit. He doesn't know it yet. He thinks I'm just quiet, that I don't ask much, that I like being invisible. Sometimes I wonder if he'll ever ask why I came, but I think I already know the answer. He won't, because it's easier not to know. And maybe that's what scares me the most. Mom. Not that they'll deny the truth, but that they'll look right at it and choose silence anyway. If I ever find the truth, I don't know if I'll still have love left in me. But I'll try. Claire." Nathaniel let the letter rest in his lap. His eyes burned, but he didn't cry, not yet. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. The world still moved below him, but inside, everything had stopped. Sometimes, the loudest apology is the one never spoken, but lived, day by day, with no expectation of being heard. Nathaniel didn't hold a press conference. He didn't write an op-ed or sit for an interview. Instead, he walked into the office of a real estate attorney and began the quiet process of dissolving certain holdings. Not all, just enough to matter, just enough to show he understood that the world did not owe him permanence. A week later, he signed the final documents. The summer house in Martha's Vineyard, the property on Lake Geneva, gone. Then he wrote one more check, a large one, made out to the Margaret Whitmore Scholarship Fund. It would support young women pursuing degrees in investigative journalism. He didn't ask for naming rights on a building, just a line on a website, and a note. In honor of a voice silenced too soon. No one told him to do it. No one praised him for it. That, he realized, was part of the point. Months passed. Winter softened into spring. Nathaniel moved again, this time to South Bend, Indiana, where the air smelled different, less of ambition, more of rain and sidewalks and early morning coffee from corner diners. His apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms, no doorman, 1 bookshelf, a garden view. The neighbors didn't know who he was. They waved politely, asked if he needed help assembling the mailbox lock, and offered leftover banana bread from church. He liked that. He started volunteering at a local adult literacy center, just a few hours a week, nothing official. He didn't bring up Chicago, or Hale Holdings, or Claire, but he thought about her every day. Then one Friday afternoon in late April, he saw a flyer taped to the coffee shop window. Community media and accountability, open forum and panel discussion, guest speakers, local journalists, educators, policy leaders, and one name, printed near the bottom in smaller text. Claire Whitmore, Director of Research, South Bend Free Press. He stared at the flyer for a long time. Then he folded it neatly and placed it in his pocket. The auditorium at the local university wasn't full, but the seats were scattered with people who cared: students, activists, residents who knew that media didn't just mean headlines, but truths that shaped their schools, streets, and futures. Nathaniel sat in the back. Claire took the stage wearing a navy blouse and slate gray skirt. No makeup, no jewelry. Her hair pulled into a low bun. She looked composed, quiet, familiar. She spoke second. Her voice was even, but there was steel beneath it. She spoke of access to truth, of bias and silence, of how some power doesn't need to lie, it only needs to omit. She didn't mention her mother. She didn't mention Hale Holdings. But Nathaniel felt every word like a thread pulled through the seams of his past. He clapped softly when she finished, not because it was expected, but because it moved him. During the Q&A, someone asked her, "What should legacy institutions do to regain public trust?" Claire paused, then said simply, "Start by stepping aside and listening." After the panel, the room scattered into smaller conversations. Nathaniel remained in his seat, unsure if he should approach. But then Claire walked past him, not fast, not avoiding, just passing. She looked at him once, met his eyes, no smile, no coldness either, just acknowledgement. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There were no words that wouldn't feel like theater, and maybe that was what she needed most for him not to perform. 10 minutes later, he stood outside near the bike racks, watching the shadows stretch across the grass. A voice called from behind, "Mr. Hale." He turned. It wasn't Claire, just a volunteer handing him a folded sheet of paper. "She asked me to give you this." Nathaniel opened it, a single line, written in blue ink. "You're learning. Keep going." That was all. But to him, it was everything. Claire never mailed the letter to her mother, but she read it often, each word a scar, a question, a whispered prayer. It began on a Tuesday morning when the wind was sharp but the sun gentle. She had brewed tea jasmine, the kind her mother used to keep in small tin containers, and sat at the worn wooden table by her kitchen window. The page before her was blank, but not empty. It felt full, like it had waited a long time for her to sit down. She picked up the pen. "Dear Mom, I thought I would feel victorious when this was over. That when the truth came out, I'd sleep easier, walk lighter. But truth doesn't undo time, does it? It doesn't bring you home. It just makes silence feel less haunted. I wanted revenge for a long time. I called it justice. But I think if I'm honest, I wanted someone to hurt the way I did. I wanted Nathaniel to carry what I had carried. But something happened. He changed. Not in the ways I expected. Not with grand gestures or apologies. He just stepped back, listened, gave something away without asking for credit. I don't know if it's redemption, but it's effort. And maybe that's enough to start from. I don't love him, not like a storybook, but I see the man he's trying to become. And for the first time, I'm not carrying anger like armor." Claire paused, her eyes scanning what she'd written. She breathed out slowly, letting the ink settle. Then she kept writing. "I found something else. A man in New Mexico wrote to me. He used to work security for the Hale family, said he recognized your name. Said he remembers a woman like you, coming around, asking questions no one liked. He never saw you again, but he also never saw a body. I don't know what to believe. Mom?" Part of me clings to the logic, the police report, the empty house, the years, but another part, the daughter part, whispers, "Maybe she's still out there, and if you are, I want to find you, not to accuse, not to dig up the past, just to say I understand now, and I love you more than I knew how to say when I was 16. She folded the letter carefully, as if it might shatter. The paper still smelled faintly of ink and jasmine tea. Claire didn't put it in an envelope, didn't address it. She knew she wouldn't mail it, but she had a place in mind. Later that afternoon, she walked to Lincoln Park, bundled in a light coat, the letter tucked inside the pages of an old book to the lighthouse, the copy her mother had once underlined, margin to margin. The park was quiet, speckled with gold leaves that danced across the pavement. She reached the bench, their bench, the one near the pond, just off the walking path, where she and her mother used to sit with paper cups of cocoa and talk about anything but the hard things. Claire opened the book to the middle, slipped the letter between two soft, worn pages, and closed it. She placed it gently on the bench, not hidden, not obvious, just left behind, like something that needed to rest. She sat beside it for a moment, letting the wind move around her. She didn't cry, but she felt something inside her shift, not an ending, a releasing. She stood and walked away, leaving the bench and the book behind. That night, as she brushed her hair in the quiet of her apartment, Claire looked at herself in the mirror, not searching for flaws, just seeing. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like someone who had to avenge something. She felt like someone who had survived. She still made tea at 5:30, only now. She made 2 cups and placed one beside the empty chair across the table. At first, it was habit, then, maybe, hope. Nathaniel had begun attending the community writing workshops that Claire taught every other Thursday at the South Bend Public Library. He never spoke. He arrived on time, sat in the back, and listened as Claire guided retired nurses, high school teachers, and quiet grandmothers through the art of telling their own stories. He didn't ask questions, didn't stay after. He just listened, and somehow, that was enough. Claire had noticed, of course, the way he took notes without looking up, the way he smiled not with his mouth, but in the stillness of his posture. He no longer looked like a man who walked into rooms expecting to be heard. He looked like someone trying, quietly, to learn how to stay. Weeks passed, then one evening, as rain softened the edges of the sky, Claire waited at the doorway of the library longer than usual. Nathaniel stepped out with his coat folded over one arm. She spoke first. "Would you like some tea?" He paused, then nodded. Back at her apartment, Claire boiled water the old way on the stove, not the microwave. She pulled down the same ceramic mugs they used to use, the white ones with blue rims. The ones Nathaniel had once joked were too small for proper tea. She didn't bring that up now. He sat at the table, silent as steam curled upward. They didn't talk about the company, or her mother, or the letter. They talked about the smell of books, about the sound autumn leaves make when they stick to the bottom of your shoes, about the little girl in her writing class who always brought glitter pens and refused to use anything else. Claire poured the tea. The cups clinked gently. She sat down across from him. They drank quietly, the kind of quiet that felt full, not tense, not forced, just still. After a few sips, Claire looked up. "I don't want to forget," she said softly. "I just want to move forward without carrying it all." Nathaniel didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly, like someone who didn't want to break the moment by moving too fast. She didn't owe him more, and he didn't ask for it. But something settled between them. A weight that used to press against every word now lifted, piece by piece. They drank in silence. Claire noticed the way he now wrapped his hand fully around the cup, not letting it sit untouched like he used to, as if warmth mattered to him more than it used to. When he stood to leave, he didn't try to hug her, didn't reach out. He simply thanked her for the tea, for the class, for her time. She nodded, then closed the door behind him gently. The next morning, when she opened her mailbox, she found a small wrapped parcel. No note, just her name on the outside. Inside was a worn hardcover copy of The Things We Leave Behind, a book she had once mentioned loving in passing. There was a slip of paper tucked between the pages, marking a single highlighted sentence. "Forgiveness is not forgetting, it's remembering without rage." Claire closed the book slowly. She didn't cry. She just held it close for a long, quiet moment. Then, at exactly 5:30 that evening, she made tea again. And this time, when she placed the second cup across the table, the chair wasn't empty. Not every love story starts with butterflies. Some begin in ashes and build themselves slowly, carefully, one quiet moment at a time. Claire adjusted the mic stand, the way she always did, 2 clicks up, 1 click down. The room wasn't full, but it felt alive. Local teachers, young reporters, even 2 high school students with notebooks in their laps. The event was titled Truth, Trust, and the Local Voice. A panel discussion held in the basement of the South Bend Community Center. Beside her sat 3 other speakers. One of them was Nathaniel. He didn't wear a suit anymore. just a sweater and slacks. He looked older, in a softer way, not worn down, but worn in. When he spoke, he didn't use corporate language. He spoke about access, about responsibility, about how truth is a right, not a luxury reserved for the powerful. He quoted Margaret Whitmore twice, and didn't make it about himself. Claire listened, not just to his words, but to the way others responded to him. They nodded, took notes, some smiled. He was no longer the man trying to command the room. He was learning how to share it. Afterward, they helped fold chairs, passed around leftover cookies, took a photo with the students. As they walked out together into the cool evening, Nathaniel offered her a half smile. "No butterflies," he said gently, as if echoing her thoughts. Claire chuckled. "I never liked butterflies much anyway. Too fragile." They walked in silence for a block, then another, not hand in hand, but close enough that their steps began to fall into rhythm. They stopped at a cafe, the kind with paper lanterns and mismatched mugs. She ordered chai. He asked for lemon tea. They sat near the window. Claire stirred her cup slowly. "You did well tonight." He nodded, not brushing off the compliment like before. "Thanks." They didn't speak of their past, didn't touch the fragile threads they had both unraveled and rewoven over the past months. Instead, they talked about the students, about a grant for local investigative reporting, about how trust is built like old brickwork, one layer at a time, sometimes uneven, but meant to last. When the rain began to fall softly against the glass, Nathaniel glanced at her. "Would you ever want to write about it?" he asked. "Our story." Claire looked out at the night. "I'm still living it," she said quietly, "and some stories don't want to be told yet. They just want to be lived." He didn't push, just nodded, and that, somehow, was more intimate than any declaration. That night, back in her apartment, Claire curled up on the couch with a pen and notebook. She didn't journal often anymore, but this time, she felt the need to mark something down, not for record, for reflection. She wrote, "He's not the man I hated. He's not the man I loved. He's just becoming." And maybe, she thought, that's all any of us are trying to do. Become, without running, without pretending, just showing up, cup of tea in hand, story still unfolding. It started with a secretary job. It ended with a man rebuilding his soul and a woman finding her peace. Nathaniel Hale now kept a journal. He didn't write every day, just when the silence inside him asked to become words. The latest entry began like this: "Dear me, you thought you were hiring a secretary. You thought quietness meant safety, obedience, simplicity. But Claire Whitmore wasn't quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because the world had once shouted over her, and she'd learned the power of waiting. She didn't steal your heart. She handed you a mirror and let you decide what kind of man you wanted to see when you looked into it. You thought love would feel like possession, but it felt like surrender. And oddly, it made you stronger. She made you learn what your father never taught you. That love, like justice, isn't something you inherit. It's something you choose again and again, especially when it's hard, especially when it's quiet." He closed the journal. The morning was pale with winter light. Outside, children were walking to school, backpacks bouncing gently. In the distance, a dog barked once and stopped. Nathaniel placed the journal on the shelf beside a worn copy of To the Lighthouse, the same edition Claire once left on a park bench. He didn't know if she would ever call what they had love, and maybe that was okay. Some connections weren't made for labels. They were made to change you. Claire lived in the same apartment, still drank tea at 5:30, still marked student papers with colored pens and notes in the margins like, "Try softer here," or "This hurts in a beautiful way." She still walked through Lincoln Park every Sunday morning, where the trees now knew her footsteps. There was a new calm in her, like a tide that had finally stopped fighting the shore. She didn't look for her mother anymore. That didn't mean she'd stopped hoping, but she'd stopped hurting from the hoping. The grief was no longer sharp. It had become a quiet companion, sitting beside her without demanding to be fed. One afternoon, she received a small envelope, no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed the two of them at the community event months ago, Claire mid-laugh, Nathaniel looking at her, the way some people look at answers they don't fully deserve. On the back, 5 words in his handwriting. Still becoming, still showing up. She smiled, then placed the photo in the back of her notebook, where she kept things she never planned to share but never wanted to forget. They didn't talk every day. They didn't plan a future. But some evenings, he showed up at her office after class, 2 cups of tea in hand. One just the way she liked it. Jasmine, no sugar, extra hot. And they would sit, talk, or not talk. The silence didn't need filling anymore. It wasn't the kind of ending books were written about, but it was the kind of beginning you whisper into, slowly, day by day, until it grows strong enough to carry its own name. She walked into a millionaire's office to apply for a secretary job, but ended up stealing his heart. Only she didn't take it. She taught it. Some of the most powerful stories aren't about fairy tale endings, but about the courage to keep walking forward, even when the path is unclear. Claire didn't find closure in a courtroom. Nathaniel didn't find redemption in a grand gesture. Instead, they both found something quieter and perhaps more lasting, the strength to choose healing over hatred and truth over comfort. This story reminds us that love isn't about perfection or easy answers. It's about presence. It's about showing up again and again for ourselves, for others, even when it's hard. We all carry wounds from our past. Some we inherited, some we created. But healing begins the moment we stop hiding from the pain and start listening to ourselves, to the people we once misunderstood, and even to those we once thought were enemies. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: we don't need to forget in order to forgive. We just need to remember, without bitterness. Because in the quiet spaces between truth and grace, that's where the heart learns how to beat again. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story touched your heart, made you reflect, or simply gave you a moment of quiet meaning, we're grateful you were here. At Shining Stories, we believe in the healing power of storytelling. If you believe in it too, don't forget to like, share this video with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak to the soul. Until next time, take care and keep your heart open.